An entire month has passed since Syria's Bashar al-Assad was overthrown by former rebel groups, bringing almost 14 years of civil war to a most unexpected fork in the road. And a lot has happened in these short few weeks. Prison dungeons of the former regime were unlocked, freeing political prisoners held by Assad enforcers. Families torn apart by war were finally reunited. Refugees began to return home, and commercial flights to and from Damascus finally resumed. But there's also been a lot to reckon with. The pain of families searching frantically for their loved ones, disappeared or missing for years, the heightened threat of Israeli invasions beyond the occupied Golan Heights, and fresh fears over what comes next. Hayat Tahrir Al Sham, HTS, that led the rebellion against Assad's government last month, has been busy at work as the de facto temporary power there. Its leader, Ahmed Al Shara, has been meeting with world leaders to discuss plans for Syria's future. He's also been working with other newly appointed ministers in his interim government, mostly to figure out what governance will actually look like in post-Assad Syria. It was decided that armed factions would be dissolved and absorbed into the state army, along with all their weapons. This alone is a complicated task in a landscape where countless militias have emerged over the years. But there are other challenges too, like local governance, rebuilding damaged infrastructure, and delivering accountability and justice. At the same time, the transitional power entrusted to HTS leaders is only temporary, and there are already concerns that the caretaker government may be overstepping its mandate and making institutional changes that it should not be making until a constitution is drafted and free elections are held. But Al Shara says this could take years. So the question is, what is going to happen until then? This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. This week, we look at the role of the interim HTS authority as it begins to lay down the groundwork for life and governance in a new Syria. HTS has been rebranding itself since Assad's government fell, and arguably even before that. It appeared to be an overnight shift, with Al Shara no longer going by his nom de guerre, Abu Muhammad al-Julani. He also switched out his military uniform for a suit, and it's playing out well for him in the public eye, especially in the West. The US has removed a $10 million bounty on his head, and state officials from the likes of Germany and France are making visits. But it remains to be seen whether the group will actually make meaningful change, from its hardline extremist ideology to a more inclusive and democratic one that serves all Syrians. To understand what has happened in the past month and what comes next, I spoke to Mu'tasim Syufi, Executive Director of The Day After, an NGO that supports democratic transition in Syria. We use the term transitional government very broadly, but what does transition actually mean in a place like Syria, which has not seen regime change in decades, really? What are the HTS rulers doing day to day in this phase now, about a month since the fall of Assad?
We have a de facto power, toppled the regime, and so far it enjoys significant support from the Syrian people, although some segments in the society have concerns, demands, and questions about the current situation and the future. At the very beginning, they gave it the name interim government, not transitional government. And they said that it will be serving only for 3 months. And after 3 months, we will shift into a transitional government. In definition, there is no clear difference between what does interim mean, what does transition mean. But according to what we heard at the very beginning, this interim government, its mission is only to take over the power from the Assad's government and to secure some public order and basic services for population, because these are eminent needs. A transitional government is the government that is going to be responsible for leading the country as a legitimate government until a permanent constitution is adopted officially and public elections are carried out. And the criteria for that government is not limited just to running the public institutions, the state institutions, but also should have a political dimension in its construction. It should be more representatives for the wider spectrum of the Syrian fabric and should include qualified people in its ranks. With respect to the other question, okay, what does transition mean? Are we transitioning from merely war to peace, silencing the guns, or from a certain regime to another regime? Or Do you want to transition from dictatorship to certain level of rational governance slash democracy, respect of fundamental human rights, separation of power, freedom of speech, elections, constitutional governance, etc.?
Julani changed his name, his uniform. It happened so quickly. Was this sudden or was this in the works for a while? Do we actually believe that HTS has been completely rebranded in the public sphere?
Well, if we listen to Al Jolani statements and Al Shaybani statements, the foreign minister, for example, they're saying now Syria should belong to all Syrians and we should respect the diversity of the Syrian people. And we want a rational governance, a just governance that respects everyone, the dignity of everyone, and the rights of everyone. Well, if we compared this to previous statements made by Al Jolani in the days when he used to cover his face, in those interviews, he made clear his political theory. He said that he does not believe in democracy or parliament. We should abide by the Sharia, and the governance should be a Sharia governance. Now, if we compare these rhetorics, they are not identical. Yet again, we did not hear clear statements from Al Jolani, the Shaybani, and the government about human rights, the principle of equal citizenship or citizenship itself, or democracy. It didn't say, for example, that, well, Christians and other Druze and Alawites are going to play leading roles in the new Syria. He just went again to this issue of the constitution will decide. Women's rights, the constitution will decide. We do not have to decide on every matter now. So there is certain level, high level, let's say, of ambiguity about their political theory.
So what's happening with the constitution now? Is it being drafted based on Sharia law? Do we actually know that this is the case? Who's going to even oversee the formation of the new constitution and make sure that it's fair?
So far, they said there will be a conference, the National Dialogue Conference. And one of the outcomes of this National Dialogue Conference will be a constitutional drafting committee. Will the constitution draft be subject to public referendum, for example, or not? We don't know. What are the criteria of the invitations of people to this national conference? We don't know. We don't know the names of the preparatory committee. There is no clarity whatsoever. And I think they are confused in terms of how to do it. I think they are receiving concerns, comments, objections from inside Syria and from outside Syria, from non-Syrian actors as well. I think they are rushing ahead of themselves to form a new government and to announce the dissolvement of Hayat Tahrir Al Sham, HTS, and other armed factions. You don't need a national dialogue conference for that.
Are we also going to be worried that the new government is going to be still fighting members of the Assad regime like we've seen in Homs?
When you don't have a clear pathway for transitional justice or for any kind of justice, you are letting or leaving a space for retaliation, for people to retaliate, for revenge, for killing out or extrajudiciary killing, like what's happening now. Every day we hear about the killing of certain regime-affiliated figures, shabiha, judges, etc. Nobody knows who is killing them. For the official troops or official patrons of HTS, they were respectful and a minimum level of problems with them. But they're saying, or witnesses coming and say that after they left, people with no certain clear uniform, with no clear identity, came also, claimed that they are HTS, and humiliated people. And even they looted some houses. So when you don't have a clear path of justice, people who have resentments, who are angry, who have beloved ones who are still missing, who were subject to torture, they are going to take revenge.
Do you think it's too soon to expect so much from a group like HTS that took power that doesn't really have experience in governance of a swath of land as big as Syria with the complications and the intricacies that it does?
Yeah, I see your point. I think regardless, no matter who is in the palace now, regardless of their identity, cannot solve Syria's problem overnight. My expectations are not to see an efficient running economy in 6 months. So far, we have to give credit for that. The security situation, for example, in Damascus is much, much better than the people were concerned before the topple down of Assad regime. All over the country, I think the level of violence, given all these factors that we talked about, the level of violence is still at minimum level so far. I think they are making good promises. They are trying to say the right things, send positive messages to everyone. So I see all of that. I see that we cannot expect them to be magicians and turn the country into the normal one overnight. But what I'm saying is that there are some missing steps that could be taken so far, and some actions that should be avoided. Like, for example, changing the curriculum. Why is that? Why do we need that?
As Mu'tasim mentioned, last week the caretaker government introduced new controversial changes to the education curriculum. At first glance, some of these changes appear to make sense, removing references that glorify the Assad regime and the Ba'ath Party. But others have triggered widespread concern, such as the reinterpretation of a Quranic verse, using a derogatory reference to other religions, and the removal of poetry that celebrates themes of love and women. Rahaf Dougli, a lecturer in MENA Studies at the UK's Lancaster University, tells me more about these changes and what they might say about the evolution of Syria's political landscape. What do we know about the changes by HTS to the education curriculum? What are some of the ones that triggered the most concern among people, and why?
These changes has not happened overnight. These changes were present in Idlib before even HTS took control in Idlib. Now, that was implemented in Idlib when HTS took control. However, they did make some extra changes, not only changes in the curriculum, but even supervise teachers in Idlib schools to make sure that they align with an Islamist kind of attitude. Now, those recent changes that we've seen under the caretaker government, they want to make these changes because the curriculum in Syria has lots of the Ba'athi ideology in it. And that's understandable that these changes should be made. However, these should have been more of an accessory changes. So removing any relevant information regarding the Ba'ath, Assad, and the Syrian army, the regime army. However, the other changes, which is changes regarding minorities, ruling by law, can tell us about an ideology that not only exclusively related to HTS, but more of a history of a governing body in northern Syria that were making these changes in terms of Islamizing the educational curriculum in Syria. I think some of these concerns were raised because of HTS being in position now in leading this kind of transitional phase. However, we should have a more of a holistic view of what has been happening to education in Syria for the last 14 years. There has been an Islamization of the Syrian curriculum, of the educational curriculum in northern Syria. And that's not only, HTS is not only the one responsible for all of these changes. But what made me angry is the justification made by the Minister of Education in the caretaker government. His evasive answers, his ideological standpoint, his justifications, loose justifications of these changes without even providing a clear answer of why these extra changes were implemented during this timing, which is like promising the Syrian people to build an inclusive and more of a pluralistic governance body.
You've also done research on education and life under HTS in Idlib, long before the takedown of Bashar al-Assad. What similarities do you see from life under HTS in Idlib that they're implementing on a larger scale across Syria now? And do you think that there are lessons that HTS can bring from its experience of governing Idlib as it tries to govern the entirety of Syria?
Specifically, Jolani or Ahmed Shara has tried to update his discourse or his rhetoric. I wouldn't use modernizing his rhetoric, but more of departing jihadi core or centric ideology. However, these kind of changes are made or addressed to the Western community. But what was happening in Idlib, like HTS has challenges to appease or try to contain its hardliners internally. So there are internal challenges and also external challenges. And I think Jolani is smarter than having or from applying the Idlib experience on whole Syria. So Sunnis in Syria are not one. They are diverse. Sunnis in Idlib are different from Sunnis in Damascus. Sunnis under regime-controlled areas have different political attitudes from the Sunni community in other parts in Syria. So, for example, in northern Syria. And we've seen in the last few days, I have noticed that there is this rivalry, not between like the previous rivalry in the Syrian political dynamics has always focused on Sunni Alawites, but now we are heading into the binarism of Sufi versus Salafism. Now, in Idlib under HTS, there has always been this narrative among the hardliners that Sufi ulamas have been co-opted by the regime for so long, and they have been used as a legitimation tool. So we might see this kind of rivalry between Sufism and Salafism. However, Ahmed Shara was also clever because he knows that he needs the Damascene Sufi Lama in order to gain internal legitimacy. So he has this kind of challenge.
What would you say is the mass public's perception of this new transitional government? Do you think that people are just happy because Bashar al-Assad is gone and anything would be better? Or do you think that they actually have faith and optimism in the new rulers?
There is a narrative now saying like Syrians have been able to overthrow a regime that's 50 years old, more than 50 years old. So anything that might happen in the future, we are ready to face any new challenge. There is that. And there is also more of concerns regarding the lack of transparency in terms of communications between the new leadership and the Syrian people. And also there is a concern regarding how we can pressure HTS into having an inclusive governance without being subject to international or Western manipulation and mobilization of Syrians. There is a need to pressure HTS into building an inclusive and pluralistic governance without completely relying on the West. Because I think relying completely on the West means that we are undermining Syrian agency here. And we need, for the last 14 years, I think, if Syrians have learned any lesson, the most important lesson is our agency and our independence and sovereignty.
Recently, an old video surfaced purportedly showing current Justice Minister Shadi Al-Waisi condemning 2 women to death for adultery and prostitution. Are we going to start to see more videos like this emerge? And should we be even concerned? Or just as they said, this is just all a symbol of what they used to be, implementing that era's laws, and that the group has actually evolved now?
An early phase after the new leadership rose to power, Syrians were happy and content that HTS or Shara is addressing their concerns and they are making these changes. However, that was made on marginal issues that will not affect the pace of HTS. Now Al-Waisi and what we saw in Al-Waisi video is something different. And I do doubt that Al Shara can exclude such figures because that will hurt his legitimate space in Idlib. And if he made and excluded figures such as Al-Waisi, there will be questions for Jolani supporters, the old loyalists. I'm not talking about the new emerging loyalist base, that there will be questioning whether Jolani is not only now adhering to a statist perspective, building a state, but more of even departing the meaning or their imagined perception of Islam or Sharia. So that's why it would be so difficult and challenging for Jolani or Ahmed Al Shara to implement accountability for these figures. Now, when transitional justice open, then we Syrians can ask that all those warlords or those who committed atrocities should be held accountable, and not only ex-regime officers, which is still now also not clear how they are doing that.
Ahmed Al Shara said it could take years to draft a new constitution. Is there a fear that he's going to consolidate a lot of power during that time? Is there a fear that this transitional government is going to become a de facto government, a permanent government, like we've seen several times across the region?
I don't have a concern if Jolani or Ahmed Al Shara is going to build legitimacy during the 3 years until we have consolidate a new constitution for Syria. I think Syrians need to learn how to accept democracy and to practice democracy by accepting any votes. So if we have elections where HTS or Jolani or Ahmed Al Shara is an actor in these elections, if he wins the election, then we need to accept that kind of results. Now, I think what we need to focus on that during these 3 years, that the new leadership should be pressured to enact laws that accept avenues for Syrians to build or establish different political parties, to be an active political agents. And I think we are all focusing so far, and that's what media outlets has been focusing on, is about building the best or the perfect constitution. However, even if we had the best constitution in the world, if this constitution was not enshrined in a political culture, in a civic political culture that respects rights of all citizens in Syria, then we are not fine. To me, as a political scientist, I think the most important thing is having a political culture that accepts democracy and accepts plurality and accepts inclusivity.
That's it for Beyond the Headlines this week. There's a lot to watch in Syria over the coming months as this country goes through pivotal changes in its history. We will continue to cover the latest on all of this on thenationalnews.com. This episode of Beyond the Headlines was produced by Ban Barqawi and audio engineered by Arthur Edison. Yasmin Al-Taji is our assistant producer and Dua Farid is our editor, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. Thank you for listening.